Hey everyone, we're super excited as we kick off a brand new year of our identity middle school ministry here at New Hope Church. And as we do this, we're going to want to kind of set the tone for where we're going throughout the night. And so as we talk about this idea that we're going to present tonight, it's something that's really important. And we're going to spend the next 3 weeks kind of unpacking something that has what I believe the potential to change the way we see ourselves and the way that we see other people. And so to get us started, what I want to do is I want to propose a question to you. A very basic question that probably all of you have an answer for. But what is the last thing that you were so obsessed with that nothing else seemed to matter? What is the last thing that you were so obsessed with that nothing else seemed to matter? And maybe, there's somebody watching this with you, and so I invite you just to turn to them and tell them what that is, or maybe just say it out loud as you think about what is the last thing that you were so obsessed with. You see, for me, it comes to this idea that my wife and I, we got new phones. And when we updated our phones, we also got, all these new promo things. And so because we have iPhones, we got Apple TV for free for 3 months to kind of try out. And it was something that we had never had before, so I started binge watching all of these television shows. And there was one show in particular that I was watching, and I got through the whole first season like in, a couple days, because that's what we do. And then I got to the second season. And I was about halfway through the second season, and all of a sudden I got that joyful notification, there are no new episodes. They were literally still releasing the episodes, so I had to wait another week before I watched the next episode. And I'm still waiting as they're rolling more and more out each week. And it was really frustrating for me because I was so obsessed with this series that I found myself so engrossed that I couldn't wait to get home from work, because what I would do is I would turn on the TV and I would watch this series, and I just kept getting, more involved with the characters and finding myself more connected to them. And all of this stuff happened, and basically what was happening is I was becoming consumed by this show. Now, chances are, maybe yours is a television show that you've been obsessed with. Maybe it's been some other things. But chances are we know what it's like to be totally obsessed with something, right? Every word we say, every thought we think, every choice we make, every little thing we do hinges around whatever that thing is. Every part of our lives seems to be so wrapped up in whatever that thing is that we're caught up in. And this series for you middle schoolers is actually called Caught Up. And it's about something that every single one of us probably has the potential to get caught up in. It's talking about this idea of comparison. Now, you've probably heard about comparison before, where, you kind of compare yourself, to something or someone else, and you find yourself in this cycle. Maybe you say, well, I love my brand new shoes. And then you see, a friend's newer, better, nicer, more expensive shoes. Or maybe you say, well, my grades are really good, and you feel really positive about that. But then you hear about the grade that your friend gets, and so suddenly your grade isn't as significant. Or maybe you say, well, I've made this video, or I did this thing on social media, and I got a whole lot of views, and it was great, and you felt really validated until you saw your friends' videos on TikTok or Instagram or Snapchat or whatever, that suddenly you were like, they have more views than I do. You see, that's comparison. And if we're not careful, it's something that we all have potential to get caught up in. But here's the difficult thing about comparison. It has a way of overtaking every part of our lives. Our thoughts, our words, our actions, our relationships is all impacted when we get caught up in comparison. And eventually it has a way of leading us to believe things that just aren't true. You see, when we compare ourselves to others, we start to believe that their lives are better than our lives in some way. We say things like, well, they have so many followers on YouTube or social media, or they made the game-winning shot, or they got to take that person to the school dance, or they have more friends than I do. And all of this starts to happen, and comparison is telling us they have everything that I want. And because of that, we start to think, well, their lives have to be better than my life. And of course, nobody's life is actually perfect. We know that, right? But the reality is that when we get caught up in comparison, we find ourselves looking at other people's lives and saying things like, well, they have a better life than me, or they have things that I want. And when that happens, it brings up all kinds of stuff. Let me give you a few examples. For some of us, when we get caught up in comparison, what we find ourselves doing is we find ourselves in a state of disappointment. We look at what other people have and we say, well, that just makes me disappointed. Others of us, instead of getting disappointed, we find ourselves getting frustrated. The fact that somebody else has something that we think we deserve, it just doesn't feel fair. And so it makes us mad. So we're disappointed, we're frustrated. Maybe for some of you, the feeling of comparison, it leads you to a state of hopelessness. And no matter how hard you try, you say, well, I'll never get to where they are. I'll never have what they have. I'll never be able to achieve that. So those are some definite negative things that comparison brings into your life. Another one is that maybe comparison motivates you. And you say, well, that sounds positive. Well, the thing is instead of giving up, you try harder, you push faster to get to where somebody else is because you want whatever they have. And so comparison motivates you. Comparison may even help you feel really good about yourself. In a way, it helps you feel good about what you have, which isn't a bad thing at all. But maybe then you start to believe that you deserve some of the things you have more than other people deserve them for themselves. And so what happens is you get caught up in these feelings. And comparison can make you feel a variety of ways. There are more than what we just listed. But here's the thing about comparison. It never really takes you anywhere. It never really takes you anywhere. As soon as you reach the things that you want, you find something else to compare against. It's never enough. The cycle never ends. And I don't know about you, but I would be wanting, knowing what I just said, I would be wanting to know, how do I break free from comparison? Now, the good news is for us today that we're not the first people in the world to get caught up in this idea of comparison, and we certainly won't be the last. It's part of being human. And so thankfully, the humans that lived thousands of years ago, just after the time that Jesus was alive on earth, they wrote down a thing or two about the struggles with comparison. And there's a couple passages that we're going to look at today that were written by a guy named Paul. Now, chances are you've probably heard of Paul if you've been around the church for any length of time. And Paul was a leader in spreading the Christian faith. Paul wrote letters to encourage people, to help them to learn more about God. And Paul wrote specifically, as we're going to see here in just a second, what it looks like to get caught up in comparison. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12, here's what he said. Oh, don't worry. We wouldn't dare say that we are as wonderful as these other men who tell you how important they are. But they are only comparing themselves with each other, using themselves as the standard of measurement. How ignorant. You see, Paul is specifically talking here about some false teachers. They were bragging about their spirituality to other people and saying, we've got it more together. We're further along. We're better than you. But I think the truths that Paul was sharing here can help us with this idea of comparison that we're exploring today. Because basically what Paul was saying is, listen, comparing yourself to others, it's not good. It's not going to get you anywhere. It's not smart. It's not wise. It's not helpful. So can we just agree not to do it? And if you think about this, Paul wanted us to know that it's really important that when we compare ourselves to each other, we find ourselves getting caught up. When we hold our real life up to somebody else's on social media, or maybe it's somebody else that we know, and we compare the way our family looks to their family, or what they have to what we have, comparison creeps in. And when that happens, we'll always end up losing. We will always end up losing. We will never break free from the cycle of comparison when we're constantly competing with other people. And that's because we're looking in the wrong place. Now, I know this is true, and I know that it's not the only way that comparison makes us feel, but there's something else that Paul said in this letter. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 18, he says, when people commend or compliment or praise themselves, it doesn't count for much. The important thing is for the Lord to commend them. Now, don't miss Paul's point here. It's not about how we compare ourselves to other people. At the end of the day, that stuff doesn't matter. It's not significant. It doesn't count for our lives. But what does count is this, is how God sees us. How God sees us, because that's where we can look to find our worth, our value, our identity. That's where we can break free from this idea of comparison, because God doesn't compare you to others. God doesn't compare you to others. You see, God made you. God designed you to be just the way you are. And because of that, God doesn't need to compare you to anybody else. The way God sees you is shaped by the love that he has for you. The way God sees you, I want you to understand that, is shaped by the love that he has for you. And that's the way that we need to be willing to see ourselves too. So instead of getting caught up in comparison, we need to remember that in God's eyes, we're always enough, because God doesn't compare you to others. Now, there's one more truth that I do want to share with you. And it's this idea to help us kind of wrap our heads around this idea of comparison a little bit better and how to break free from this cycle. It's some wisdom that comes from the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament. It's about halfway through. You've got the book of Psalms, and then you go to the next book, which is Proverbs. And it's a book of wisdom and insight. And in Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23, there's this really well-known verse that says, "Guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life." You see, comparison starts in our hearts. Comparison starts in our hearts. So if we want to avoid getting caught up in the negative parts of comparison, then we have to stop it before it starts, where it starts, which is in our hearts. And as this proverb says, we need to guard our hearts. And so maybe you say, okay, well, I want to do that. I want to guard my heart against comparison, but how do I do that? What does that look like? Well, the first thing is to pay attention to your feelings. Pay attention to your feelings. Notice the way your mood or your outlook on life changes when you start to compare yourself to somebody else. Maybe you say, well, I look at them and I feel disappointed, or I feel frustrated or angry or anxious. Those feelings may help you understand that you're caught up in comparison. So the first thing to do is to pay attention to your feelings. The second thing to do is to find out what's causing your constant comparison. What are you looking at? What are you thinking about? What are you doing when you start to feel comparison creeping in? What's causing those negative feelings of comparison? If it's something in your control, then take a step away from it. Close the app, turn off the TV, take a break from that friend group for a little bit of time. If it's something you can't control, talk to somebody that can help. Maybe it's a parent or a small group leader. Those are great places to start because they want to help you identify steps to guard your heart so you can break free from the things that are causing comparison in your life. Celebrate what you do have. So pay attention to your feelings, figure out what's causing it, and celebrate what you do have. Instead of filling your heart with comparison, fill it with a celebration of all the things you do have. Think about the things that you're thankful for, the things that you like about yourself, the things that are good in your life. And in fact, if you start to focus on those things, chances are you'll probably focus on what God thinks about you, which is a great place to start. You see, when you're tempted to compare, fill that space in your heart with something better. Fill it with the things that remind you of the truth that God doesn't compare you to others. You see, every single one of us struggle with this idea of comparison in different areas of our lives. And the good thing is we don't have to struggle alone. That's one of the reasons that we have small groups, which we spent time talking about last week, is this idea that we want you to talk through and process through things to become more aware of them. And so I hope that you'll open up to your small group leaders or your parents or a friend about this idea of how you're struggling with comparison to maybe help you break free from it today. And as you do that, I want you to think about this question as we wrap up our time together. And the question is this, is what area of your life do you tend to compare yourself to others? What's one area of your life you tend to compare to others? Let me pray for you. God, we just thank you so much that We don't have to compare ourselves to other people, and we know that you don't compare us to other people because you made us unique and specific for a reason and for a purpose. And so, God, as we begin this journey of looking at this idea of comparison, we pray that you would lead us and guide us and direct us, that you would help us to pay attention to our feelings, to learn where the negative feelings of comparison come from, and to celebrate the positive things that we have in our lives. God, ultimately, we pray that you would help us to see ourselves as you see us. That's based on your love for us, which is unending. And so, God, help us to fixate on those things as we draw closer to you each and every day. Jesus, we love you. We thank you. And we ask all these things in your name. Amen. Well, thank you so much for tuning in to this first week of our series, Caught Up, looking at the idea and this theme of comparison. We hope that you'll continue to join us throughout this series or join us in person next week as we meet Sunday nights at 6 o'clock in the youth room at New Hope Church. Have a great and wonderful rest of your day, and we hope to see you soon.